Good to see you, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us to this month's Practice as Research seminar. Today we have got with us Dr. Agata Lulkowska, who is going to be talking about taming your inner artist, the challenges of creative practice-based research. Before I hand over to Agata, I'm just going to quickly introduce her. Now, Agata is a senior lecturer in film production in the Department of Film, Media and Journalism, and her background is in film practice, installations and photography. She's also a prolific interdisciplinary researcher with the main interest in practice-based research, intercultural communication, ethnographic film, experimental film, short fiction, politics of representation and world cinema. You can tell she's done a lot of work in the artistic sort of realm, and that's why I'm really excited to hear from her today. So we've been talking about what practice as research means for her, and what it means to create that person, the researcher and the artist, as one coherent perhaps person. Most recently, Agata has been actually made taken on the role of the head of the Practice as Research group at the University of Staffordshire, and excitingly, Agata has been shortlisted for the AHRC Research in Film Award, and the award ceremony for that is happening today. So obviously we don't really know yet what's happening there, but congratulations for being shortlisted first of all, because that is a massive achievement, and I do hope that you're actually going to win it. I really genuinely do. I'd like to hand over to you now, Agata.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you for such a lovely introduction. I cannot promise about how coherent my work or my personality is, but I will try to provide at least some coherent introduction about it. So thank you so much. So what I'm gonna try to share my screen right now, and hopefully it is going to be working. And is it working at the moment?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Wonderful. So first of all, thank you so much for joining this seminar, and thank you so much, Nicole, for the invitation. I feel really delighted to be here today, and thank you so much, because I realize there's so many things going on out there. So thank you for being here. I will try to keep you entertained over the next 25 minutes. I'm gonna press a timer because I have a tendency to speak quite a lot when I talk about things I'm really excited about, which obviously is the case right now. So I'm gonna ask Nicole to perhaps tell me when I'm closer to the end of my time, because otherwise I might just completely forget about my
No worries. I will interrupt. No worries.
That's lovely. Thank you. So I know that Nicole already introduced me, but I'm just going to very briefly, there's a reason why I have an introduction over here, because I think what I'm trying to talk about is this idea of a work in practice-based research from a perspective of someone who has really quite a lot of background in creative practice. So in my case, as we just heard, is film, photography and installations. And perhaps the important thing I should mention is my education, because I think it kind of contributes to what I am and why I do things the way I do. So I studied film direction, which was a very hands-on, 100% practice-based, obviously by definition degree, and then another one which was very hands-on as well, which was digital media arts. Then I also studied film and media studies, which was very theory-based. And then, surprisingly, I did my PhD at the Department of Iberian and Latin American Studies, but only because I was working with a Colombian group of filmmakers. Now, this PhD, by definition, this department was not in any way related to any practice, but I made it a practice-based PhD because I was working with filmmaking practice. Now, so we have 2 degrees which are very theoretical, 2 degrees which are very practical. So I felt really prepared in these 2 areas, but I never really have a chance for anyone just to actually tell me how to put these 2 things together. And that was the work I had to do by myself in my head, really. And I did a lot of different things. So I was also involved in work with the Discovering Latin America Film Festival, where I was the artistic director and head of programming. And I do quite a lot of things at the moment in relation to just trying to bridge this gap, because I think it still exists between the creative world and academia. So I co-founded and I'm directing a film festival and a conference, which kind of run together. And I'm doing a lot of editorial work because one of the things I'm really interested in is how you publish and how do you disseminate your practice-based research. But the main project I will be talking about today is a project which took me 8 years to complete, for which Nicole very kindly mentioned I was shortlisted for the award, which is a film project which I did in Colombia with a group of indigenous communicators. So I'll get back to you. So you could introduce me in this way, but I could also introduce myself in that way. And there is a reason I'm doing this, because I'm going to be talking, of course, about research and using creative media for different purposes. But when I think about who I am, there's a lot of way to introduce myself depending on the context and the situation I talk about myself. So I could talk about myself as an academic, I could talk about myself as a person who's running film festivals, but I can also present myself as a photographer, as a daughter, as a friend, as a partner, and so on and so forth. And depending on the situation, even though I'm obviously the same person, I would be presenting myself in a slightly different way, in a slightly different context. I would be perhaps wearing different clothes. The way how serious or silly I am will also matter significantly. And I think this was a really interesting metaphor for me to think about the work I do in relation to practice-based research and the media I use. So in my case, mostly film and photography, and how using the same medium can really be very different depending on a context and situation. The same way, like the way I present myself or introduce myself will be very different depending to the situation we are talking about. So my plan for today is overly ambitious, and I won't be able to hit all the points I have over there. But in essence, I'm just going to very, very briefly try to establish what art practice-based research means for me and who we are as practice-based researchers. Then, of course, I'm just going to be using my example, and I will hint towards some other really exciting examples of what other people do, because, of course, we could be here for another year just discussing the variety and richness of the potential of practice-based research. But the main points I want to address today is the challenges of applying creative and artistic training for research purposes, because that's what I really am interested in, and perhaps aims and objectives, or what drives creative artistic practice when compared to traditional research. Now, the other 2 points we could discuss, but I think we won't have time, is what are the challenges of being a person who is by definition interdisciplinary, which will be the case for everyone who's working with practice-based research, or almost everyone. And the other element, which I already mentioned, which is the question of dissemination, and how the context of where you disseminate and how you disseminate your outcomes, your outputs, matters. So moving on, this is a slide I used for another presentation I did in the past, and I always think about my work as being a little bit confusing, perhaps, for people who would like to very quickly understand which of these images are taken for research or which of them are taken for creative practice. And I can guarantee you that unless I tell you all the details about all these different things, it's not really very straightforward to understand which of these images was taken or was made for so-called research or creative practice. Now, I need to be very clear here that what I'm not trying to do here is to create a separation or division or between these two practices, because they obviously come very close together. What I'm trying to understand in the way of approaching my research, where I use my creative practice as a method, where does this division, where does this distinction start and what does it end? So until which point can I consider myself an artist and use my training from an artistic background? At what point do I have to start thinking about what is my research about? Now, this is probably the first time I admit in public that I actually do write fiction, but as another very interesting example, we as academics, we definitely engage in different forms of academic writing. We disseminate our practice, even though we work with practice-based, we obviously still write about it. But I also, and many of us, write fiction and other things. I cannot stop just plugging it. This amazing book Nicole has written, which was really, really inspiring, thinking about how you reflect on your practice, and it could be both creative practice and research, and I think it's really interesting. So we obviously engage in so many different forms of writing. Now, obviously, it will look very differently. So when you write your fiction, you don't necessarily have to follow the same structure, and you don't follow the same aims and objectives when you're engaging in specifically defined creative practice, especially when you're dealing with specific requirements from your journal or book editors. Now, when I started to think about what kind of criteria you have to follow, I actually used this REF criteria, which I reflected on in relation to both artistic practice and research. When you think about research excellence, of course, you can be translated into creative practice excellence. You need to make sure that your creative practice is fantastic, it's great, it's conducted to the highest standards. The same about context. We need to understand your context, no matter if you're working with traditional research, creative practice, or practice-based research. Methodology could be translated here as sound techniques and understanding how you're doing and what you're doing. Outputs and dissemination, it goes without saying that whenever you create artistic, creative practice, you need to do it because you want to have some kind of dissemination afterwards. It doesn't stay in your drawer like my fiction actually stays, which is a very different category here. Impact, definitely, again, in relation to creative practice, we can talk about audiences' perception and appreciation or lack thereof, which I'll get back to in a moment. Again, engaging with partners. So in the case of creative practice, we engage with art institutions, galleries, again, editors, and so on and so forth, and demonstrating your competency to manage research projects or creative practice projects. So if you look at these criteria, they're not very different. They're slightly differently interpreted in relation to specific elements, but they really follow the same idea. And what is more important in terms of the way we approach it, it definitely follows this cycle of inspiration. I cannot actually see my screen, so I'm just going to inspiration, action, and reflection, and it kind of goes in repeated cycle. You get inspired, or you find an idea for your research project, you do it, you reflect on it, and that continues over and over again. Now, there are so many different examples of practice-based research, and I'm not here to discuss what practice-based research is, but I really like this example as one of my favorite work, which really encapsulates the idea of practice-based research, which is a Norwegian artist called Sissel Tolaas. I don't know if I pronounced her name correctly, I hope so. And she's done a fantastic piece of work, which is called A Smell of Fear. So what she did, she extracted a sweat of people who were feeling fear. Because she worked also with victims of violence, so that's another one of the examples. She distilled it, and then she painted this big white canvas in the gallery space for people to just go to the gallery and literally smell fear. Now, I cannot think about any other way you could do this where you can literally smell fear. It's just impossible to do the same research with the same outputs and outcomes in any other way. It really has to be practice-based research. So again, this idea of answering your research question through your practice, which is something which we need to think about whenever we try to see the difference, which I really think is still a problem for some institutions. What is the difference between practice-based research and just practice, and how does it really gets to be contextualized, which is quite interesting. One of the things I would like to mention, which is really fascinating, is a practice-based seminar series, which is a sister to what Nicole is running here, where I just look at the trajectory and all the elements of practice-based research, from how to define it, how to design it, what the methodologies are, how you disseminate it, what's the impact, and so on and so forth. And what I did in the first round of the seminar, in the first session, I asked my participants to just give me a very brief overview of what the research question was and what was the artifact, or what kind of discipline they place themselves. And it was just a very, very difficult task for me to just bring you some examples here, because it was just absolutely fascinating. And it just gave me the idea of how rich this idea of practice-based research is. So some of the questions people told me about were, can you feel dance, or do you have to see it? The role of sound, nature, and healing in personal and collective urban transformation. What is the impact of theater making in children's self-concept? How interactive products can challenge people's behavior towards littering, or a moving image inquiry into visual thinking in dyslexia. Really, really incredible questions. And some of the artifacts which were described were things like a shoe prototype, maps, textiles, public interactive sound installation, graphic novel, handcraft weaving, digital sound map of a city, motion graphics videos, and so on and so forth. So it's just really, really interesting how many different ways we have in approaching this kind of research. Now, of course, many of these artifacts here could be applied just for traditionally understood art practice. But of course, there is more to that. And I'm kind of getting there very, very slowly, keeping in mind the time we have. So what I'm going to show you a very short fragment. Sorry, it's a blank screen now. I'll get there in a second. Of my show reel for a fiction short films, just to give you a teaser of what kind of work I was doing before. And that would lead me to talk about my practice-based films. So just very briefly, I hope you can hear the sound. Okay, I'll stop here, just because there's so many things I wanted to show you. But the point of me, oh, what's going on? Yes, we can hear. The point of me to show you this is to contrast it with what I did for the main project I'm talking about, which is the project I did in Colombia with the Indigenous Communication Collective. So I'm just going to play you a trailer from that film at the moment, if my screen behaves.
Helping each other, then what are we doing? If we don't take care of each other, then who do we care for? There always must be give and take. We all know that taking is easy. For all the withdrawals we make, returns show that we care. It's not all about you, you know. It's not all about you, you know. It's not all about you, you know.
Okay. Oh, so the reason I showed you these two short fragments together is to illustrate how I worked in the past. And there was an example with the photograph. So I would pay a lot of attention to the aesthetics. I would obviously have big crew, which helped me work with sound, with image, with all the other elements. Whereas this film was just made by myself purely. And the reason for this, because is the community I was working with was just, first of all, they were in a very, very isolated place. They were not necessarily very keen to collaborate with any people from the outside. So when I got there, I wasn't even sure if I was going to be able to make the films. It was virtually impossible to bring a crew with myself. So I just had to follow them and see what they're doing and help them with their filmmaking. And at some point, they actually asked me, why aren't you making your own film? So I was there by myself, just with my camera, without a sound person, without a camera person, without anything, not really knowing what the plan was, and just following my contributors and collaborators, just observing what I was doing and trying my best to capture what was going on. That's a very, very different way for me to work when compared with previous films or photography projects. Now, this is sometimes how I felt when I was in a region. I was so amazed by the beauty of people and places. I just wanted to take beautiful photographs. And then it was really challenging for me to remind myself, well, actually, you're not here to take beautiful pictures. This is not one of your photographic exhibitions. You are here to do some research, and your research is about documenting what's going on and thinking about your position as a Western filmmaker who goes there and really questions the possibility to work with these people. So it was a very rewarding and extremely frustrating piece of work. Now, anecdote I have for you is that this festival was just rejected from pretty much all the festivals where I submitted it for. It just got a couple of awards for research, awards of excellence for research. But at the same time, it was nominated for perhaps one of the most prestigious, if not the most prestigious, recognition for research in film, which made me think, oh, obviously, I've made a really horrendous film, but it's a good piece of research. And I was very aware of the price I had to pay for this. And I can guarantee you that if I took a crew with myself and I went there, I wouldn't be able to make the same film. So that was the price I had to pay. Now, this is when I was trying to really, really break it down into this division, this distinction between how I personally work with my artistic projects and how I work with my research project, and where this learning took place, where I had to put these two things together in my head, as I said, having preparation in both areas, but just really trying to understand how that works. So in terms of my artistic projects, most of the time there was no time constraints. I could just work with my project for as long as I wanted. Whereas for most research projects, we know that we have limited time, we have deadlines, and we have to deliver. Again, with my artistic projects, usually I would start with a very, very vague idea, which was explored through repeated and ongoing experimentation. So the photograph you see on the top right-hand side of the screen is just one example of an installation I did, for which the idea was, I just want to explore how we look at human body. Because what I realized that when I look at people, when we look at each other, when we talk, for example, we just look at each other, but we don't really see the details. So, for example, this photograph over there is a close-up of my model's eyebrow. Well, I realized that I know faces of so many people, but I don't really look at them. I don't know how the eyebrows look like. I don't know how the elbows look like. The basic elements of their faces or hands, which you would normally look at, but you just don't really realize how they look like. So the way the exhibition looked like is, I had a gallery space, which was, it was full of a kind of decorated, if you like, with black fabric. And the moment you enter the gallery space, you could see a projection of this kind of photographs, so close-ups of elements of human body, which are something you definitely have seen before. You might not easily recognize what they were from this kind of photographs. And in that room, there was a sound booth, which I also covered with black fabric. So it was basically a box, a cage, where my model, whom I photographed for these photographs, whom I used for these photographs, he was inside, but you couldn't see him because the box was covered, the sound booth was covered with black fabric. And I built a lens through which people could see fragments of his body. So again, you enter the gallery, you see this image of his eyebrow, for example. You think, oh, I don't really know what that is. You go to the lens, you see through, and you might see his eyebrows, like, oh, actually, this is how the eyebrow look like. And it was questioning how people look at a human body. But the way I developed it, it was from weeks and weeks of just experimenting and thinking, well, how can I run it? And I didn't really know what I was going to achieve at the first place. Now, obviously, with your research projects, no one would ever approve your research project or give you any funding unless you have very clear aims and objectives before you even start working on it. So it's a very, very different way of working. Again, with the example I've just described, I had a patient model whom I could direct. So I could tell him, well, do this, do that, can we repeat it, and so on and so forth. With the other example I've just showed you with my research projects, of course, I was in no position to tell my collaborators what to do. I just had to follow without even knowing what was that they were going to do. Very, very different, as I said, at some moments frustrating process for me because I couldn't prepare for this. And that's why all the images, or most of them, are very shaky, and the sound is really bad at many points. I could not control it, and that was the beauty of it. Again, with the research projects, with the artistic projects, there's no really need to deliver. I'm doing them for myself because I want to, and most of them were unfunded anyway. So there was no pressure in any way for me to deliver anything. And of course, in terms of your research projects, clear and decent deliverables are expected. And of course, in terms of the artistic projects, there's more options for freedom. So you don't really need to prove anything, and a potential failure could be part of the process. Again, in terms of research projects, failure is not really an option. So for example, with that film I'm talking about, when I was not really sure if my collaborators would even want to let me film what they were doing, my idea at that point was, well, if that's not going to happen, my film will be about the fact that I cannot make the film I wanted. So there was no option. I just don't make it. I had to make a film about not being able to make a film I wanted. So obviously the approach is much more structured. Oh, I'm running out of time. Am I running out of time, Nicole?
No, it's all right. We are having a little bit of a chat in the chat box already. So there are some topics that people want to discuss. So if you can kind of, spend another sort of 2 or 3 minutes, but that gives us then a good opportunity to kind of ask you some questions still.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm just going to quickly wrap it up. So as I said, the question here, which is interesting in relation to this kind of work, is the dissemination. Where to disseminate your practice-based research and who are your audiences. And one of the really interesting example here is Renzo Martens, who's, I believe he's Dutch artist, whose work is just really interesting, but very controversial. So his first significant film, Enjoy the Poverty, which is really controversial, was actually displayed in a gallery space rather than in a cinema. And how does it change the way you discuss what this work is about? I'm not going to be talking about all the other initiatives I'm doing, but the point is that what I'm trying to do is to explore what kind of ways are the most effective to, as I said before, bridge this gap between academia and research, and just be able to disseminate your work to perhaps different types of audiences and what kind of impact it can create. So I'm going to skip this kind of theoretical things about research, where I basically point to the idea that many times when you work on practice-based research and you define your methodology, very often points back at you as a researcher, and it becomes a form of ethnography. I'm just going to skip that, and I'm going to skip this section. I'm just going to get to the summary here. And I think when we work on different types of practice-based research, the questions, and this is what I was going through when I was working on that project, is again, the questions we are going to be asked when we justify our research, which is how to define your contribution to knowledge. And is the originality of the artwork enough? I argue it's not. It's not enough. And it goes back to this idea of reflexivity. So the triangle between theory, practice, and reflective evaluation of what you're doing. And then again, how do you evidence your research in this kind of context? How do you evaluate your outputs? What is the impact? How do you measure impact in relation to, let's say, film production, which is done for research? How do you contextualize it? And what's the relation between your artwork and the text? In that case, your research reflection or contextualization. What other circumstances you have to consider, and what's the role of this reflective practice? Many people will argue that this is what makes the difference between just creative practice and practice-based research. And this is just one of the case studies which I think is an amazing way to talk about a film which is very, very successful as a film, but also as a piece of research. And it was just submitted for the ref as and really, really successful, at the same time, very successful commercially. But I think this is probably a good moment for me to stop. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen because I cannot see the chat and I cannot see anyone else. And I'm all yours here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Agata. So first of all, round of applause, virtual and real. It was really, really interesting. And obviously, as the person who's moderating this, I've got the privilege of actually jumping in with the first question. But I'm not going to hog the question that I want to ask for my personal interest. I'm going to ask on somebody else's behalf. So there's a practical question that was raised in the chat box. How do you manage the relationship between these two different practices in terms of time and mental energy? So you were talking about being an artist and a researcher. How do you manage that? Personally, so the comment continues, personally, I find that I sacrifice my own artistic practice because the academic work is more pressing with structures and deadlines. And therefore, you know, what do you do? So how do you deal with that?
Yes, I'm afraid this is a very sad answer. It's not really possible for me to continue both things simultaneously. So I kind of semi-abandoned my artistic practice at the moment, and I'm not able to work on two things at the same time because of how intense my academic work became. And the reason is because what I realized that there's so much potential in terms of exploring this idea of practice-based research. And I'm really, really passionate at the moment to create some kind of toolkit and support system for existing practice-based researchers, because I know what I think about myself in the past. And as I said, I had really great support for practice and for research, but not really for these two things together. And I would like to really explore the possibility to do this. So at the moment, my research practice is semi-abandoned. The only thing I find time to do is to write my fiction, which is my secret. As I said, no one knows about it, but I don't really obviously find time to make films or even engage in installations of photography as much as I would like to. This is very, very difficult. But I think from my perspective, because I use so much inspiration from my past creative work for my current academic work in relation to thinking how I bring these two things together. I'm sure that I will be able to find some, or I'm hoping I'll be able to find some time to carve some time to actually work on some purely creative practice, just to use it as my talking point and thinking point for what I'm trying to do, and for my way to trying to understand how these two things can be brought together. Because as I said, I don't want to separate. I don't think they're separate, but my experience or my background and my education has been separate. So these two things brought together is something which I'm still working on. So in that case, I think I would almost find some time to work on creative practice as part of my research, even though I'll be working on a creative practice, if that makes sense. But no, I don't have a magic answer in terms of how to find time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It says in the comments as well, thank you very much for this honest answer. Because yes, that's exactly it. That, you know, it's really difficult to kind of have a simplistic answer when really the matter is so difficult. Do you want to come in now on the question, or do you want me to raise it? So I've had a couple of people asking in the chat box, is all artistic practice in some way potentially research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question, and that's what I mentioned, that there is still lack of agreement among people who work with creative practice and research in terms of what is that we're talking about. I don't think there's a definition which everyone agrees with. I can just tell you about my personal opinion here, and I by no means claim that I'm right here, because I'm just one of many voices. I don't think that all the artistic practice is completely equal to research. Saying that, I believe that all the artistic practice includes element of research by definition. I still think that because of the requirements, and that's why I looked at the REF criteria and the things we have to deliver, I think there's more structure and more expectations when it comes to research, even if it's practice-based research, as defined by academic standards. And I still think that with your creative practice, you have more freedom in the way you approach it and interpret it. As I said, you still do some research. You always have to do some kind of research to prepare for your creative practice. But I do think they're slightly different. And again, as I suggested before, for many people is this element of reflexive evaluation, of reflection, to really understand how your creative practice inform your methodologies of the way of doing things and informs the practice, which makes a difference. Again, this is just one of many ways of thinking about it. I think there's a slight difference. It doesn't mean that there's a very, very strict line which makes these two things completely separate. Of course, it's not. And as we've seen, there's lots of similarities, even if you think about this REF criteria, because these requirements or criteria can be interpreted in a very similar way when you just think about purely creative practice. So there's an overlap. I think it's the way I think about it. It's this kind of very useful overlap, but they can be a little bit different depending on how you want to undertake your research projects and or creative projects, and what is that you want to do with it.
Thank you. So I'm going to jump in here now. One of the things that's come up a few times now in the different seminars that we've had was this kind of what you've just hinted at, the kind of the role that you're taking as an artist or a researcher, and whether that distinction in a way is in your own mind. And in the first session that we had, Mark Smith was talking about how this is kind of, a work of actually going back to yourself and finding your own self. And that's something that we were talking about last time as well, when Anya McAllister was talking about voice, authority and truth, where she was kind of saying, how much of herself does she bring into the poetic inquiry and the poetry work that she does. So I'm kind of throwing this question out here now, and I'm sorry, Agata, that you were on the receiving end here, but it's the person that's here today. And you did actually mention autoethnography yourself as well in your talk. So is what you do, the practice as research, is that autoethnography, or how does it relate to autoethnography?
I think it's a very, very important question, and I'm actually grateful for it, because I think we should ask ourselves how we position ourselves in relation to what we do. And the answer to this for me is I've never, ever thought about my work as autoethnography until I started reflecting on what is that I'm doing. And I realized, of course, it's autoethnography. Of course it is. So when I started working on that film, my aim was, okay, I'm just going to document what this amazing group of this collective of Indigenous filmmakers, what is that they're doing and how they're trying to use film as a way to respond to violence, physical, symbolic, political violence in the region and how they want to gain agency to just have a voice in this kind of discussion. That was my aim. Then the more I worked on it and the more I reflected on it, I realized that it's not really about that. It's about my position as a Western researcher who has the audacity to go there and just think that she can just make a film about this community, when at the same time I'm criticizing so many other past productions of Western filmmakers who went there and did the same. And I felt like I had to do a lot of thinking about my positionality in that and how my position is different to what I'm already criticizing. So of course it became a form of ethnography, and effectively this film is not as much about this amazing collective and what they do, but about myself as a researcher who's trying to understand her role in this kind of work. And again, I cannot speak for everyone here, but I do believe that, as we said, the definition of practice-based research for me is you use your practice to answer your research question, which by definition means that you're designing the way you work with your practice, which reflects on you as an artist, if you like, or a practitioner, whichever definition you want to use. So in some way or another, it will always become a form of ethnography. And I think if we deny it, we're kind of missing the point a little bit. So I do believe it is a very self-reflective practice.
Thank you for that answer. Now, one of the things that's been kind of discussed earlier, as you were talking, we were talking about, you know, the kind of the distinction that you made between the artistic project and the research project, and we all found that that was really, really helpful in kind of trying to understand the logic behind what you were saying. The question for me is, if you're this kind of artist researcher, do you have to be an artist in order to be able to engage in practice-based research in the way that you define it, or can you do that without actually being an artist?
Yeah, I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can. And again, as always, I'm just kind of obviously trying to understand it from my position, because I never really thought I would be engaging in research when I started taking photographs when I was 3 years old, and I was just engaged in this kind of creative practice from a very, very early age. And I didn't think, oh, one day I'll apply it to my research. I didn't plan it. But of course, it's possible for anyone to use creative practice. So let's use the example of film and photography. You just need to learn how to do it, or you need to get collaborators who understand how to do this from a technical standpoint. And you definitely don't need to come from this artistic background. In fact, it might be actually easier not to do it, because then you don't have this kind of tension I had when I was in this beautiful place, wanting to take beautiful photographs and just being completely torn apart, because I really wanted to do both. And I had to really discipline myself to understand, well, you're not here to take beautiful photographs. That's not the reason you're here. You have to work on your research. So I presume if someone's coming from non-artistic background, it might be even easier. So I definitely think it's possible.
Oh, thank you. So we have got a comment there. Do you want to come in as a voice, or do you want me to read this out? I always feel like I don't want to speak for other people, but at the same time, I'm great. Thank you. Yay.
I've been typing all day. I'm quite happy not to use my fingers. Brilliant proposition, and I'm really enjoying this because it's kind of what I do day to day in my role, running a postgraduate programs in Plymouth. And I know I recently finished my practice research, a PhD, 2 and a bit years ago, and held steadfast to the notion I was making work and also developing practice research. And I was lucky enough to come across, I was working with moving image, fine art and performance theories, and Robin Nelson gave me some space to think about the idea of and when you mentioned autoethnography, it really did chime with the notion that essentially if you kind of admit to the fact that the practitioner is the kind of agent in the production, it has to be put under the same lens. The practitioner yourself needs to be put under the same lens. And he talks about, he's got a lovely diagram. We love a good diagram, lovely triangle. I'm sure you know it. Know this, know that, know how. And to be frank, hands up, I use it with the students, with the master students, and they get a lot of comfort. This is the interesting thing from it, because they have this schism between the tension of research that is sort of disembodied. It's this thing that has a shape and it's maybe sharp edged, and then they have their practice, and trying to fold those two things together. When I said, no, you're in the middle of all this, and suddenly they have a way of describing, as he mentioned, processual knowledge that gets produced through the process. And it's, I always found it fascinating that students are comforted, and then they can get on top of the notion that if they can put themselves in that context, that they are the agent in that relationship, making that link. And yes, they have to examine their motivations, and it frees them up. It frees them up from this tension that it does exist and still exists all the way through, but it helps them come to terms with the tension, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much for this comment, Stephen. I think it's so important. And as I mentioned previously, I personally am trying to really think very hard how to really approach this kind of thing of training new generation of practice-based researchers, because when you talk to them, many of them feel very isolated, which I think we can completely understand, mostly because by definition, each of the projects will be very different. There's no really a template you can apply. So thinking about this kind of solid elements, you almost need to position yourself within, and things which can help you position yourself with this really, really dynamic beast, which is very difficult to define, could be really reassuring. And I am very grateful for these comments, because I think it really, really helps. And I think even for myself, I don't necessarily consider myself an expert following all these years of doing things, because every time you do something new, you almost start from the beginning again. You have to really find everything from scratch. And it's never really, oh, I know it now. I know now how to do it. I might be more aware of certain things, and I might be more aware of challenges. And I might be more aware of things I should consider, but it doesn't necessarily make it easier. Which is a good in a way, because it keeps you entertained and keeps you challenged, and keeps you really insecure about what is that you're doing, which I think is a very important element of this kind of work. Because if you were very comfortable with this, I don't think it would have the same potential. So thank you for that comment. Yes.
Thank you very much. We've got one more person joining us in this conversation. Can I hand over to you?
Yes. It just occurred to me that perhaps there's an element of, I don't know, reification in play here. Surely when we talk about autoethnography, etc., we've been talking no more as a kind of brands, albeit academic brands. That's sort of one point, really. The second point is, in the olden days in the Bauhaus, they used to talk in terms of art as applied visual research, but also as art as the practice of art as a kind of building process of building of the individual. So perhaps actually the important thing here, both in artistic practice and in research, is that element of reflection and inquiring, just as you had to begin to inquire about your kind of inner colonialism when you went off to Columbia. Yes, good point. All right.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more here, and thank you, Nicole. Absolutely. I think it's extremely important. I think and again, like it's quite interesting in relation to this specific project. And for me, it's still ongoing. And the way I sometimes say that it took me 8 years. 8 years was the PhD I did. The project is still continues, even though I finished it years ago, and it still continues in relation to this reflection. Because the more I start working with the idea of what practice-based research really is, the more I still discover more things which I haven't thought about before. And it's through this creative practice. Absolutely, it's a process which is I believe never really stops. And I think don't want to get too philosophical about life right now, but I think it's so fascinating how you do something and you don't really pay much attention to it because you think it's insignificant, something not necessarily related to research. And years later, you realize, well, actually, that was so important. It taught me this and that, and I can use it for what I'm doing right now. And I think one of the things I mentioned in the PowerPoint, which we didn't have time to talk about, is this idea of being interdisciplinary. I think for many academics, especially early career academics, they feel really nervous about not being able to position themselves within one discipline. And I could never possibly do it because it's very difficult for me to really define myself, but I don't necessarily feel I need to do it. But it's this idea of like you do so many different things, it looks like they just lead you nowhere and you're not really becoming an expert in one specific things. And there's so many different things you do and it just doesn't really make sense until one day it does. And these things kind of connect through your reflective practice. So there's so much value in this. I think maybe this reflective practice is almost the most important thing of this triangle we talk about, because this is where you really understand the value of all the practice and theories and how you contextualize the things and put them together through this creative practice. I mean, this is where the knowledge is really created. Of course, the main artifact or the main the way you demonstrate what you've done is through your practice, but again, without this creative, the reflective evaluation, I think it's just, it's very easy to kind of not realize certain things and just miss the point almost. And sometimes it takes many, many years and it's okay. I think it's fine. We don't necessarily have to squeeze all the knowledge straight away, because I think sometimes it's nice to wait for another thing to happen and just realize that, well, actually it did make sense what I did so and so many years ago.
Thank you very much, Agata. So I would suggest that this is kind of the problem that we all have. The more you know, the more you realize how little you actually know. So the more you do, you suddenly realize, oh, I didn't really know that. So you've got to go back to square one, and then you're like, you know more, and then you're like, oh, I've got to go back to square one again. So in the end, you end up in square minus 100 rather than plus 100. So I think that's one of the problems that we all have. So can I just say, I'm quite aware of the time. I want to make sure that we finish on time. Thank you very, very, very much for the talk today. It was incredibly interesting. It was super exciting to have you here. I genuinely wish you best of luck for tonight as well. I'm sure all of us are going to keep an eye out on the announcement as to what's happening this evening. I would like to just take the second to kind of plug the next session for those of you who are here, which is going to be on positionality in PAR research, where Dr. Sarah Young is going to explore the question of researcher positionality when working with participants. Sarah is a researcher working within applied linguistics and Polish migration, and she's sort of at the IOE, UCL IOE, so she's one of our own. Please do join us for that. That's going to happen on the 5th of January. And if you want to catch up on any of the other things that you may have missed, the PAR YouTube channel, the Buzzsprout channel, the podcast apps, all of the information is on the slide here, and it will be an opportunity for you also to kind of connect with the mailing list if you're not on there already, but here are the links as well in the chat box. So again, Agata, it was absolutely lovely to have you here. Thank you so much for doing that today, and I wish everyone a good 2 weeks off, hopefully, and I'll see you all refreshed and full of energy in January.